Well, good morning. I'm TJ Savereno. I am an extension associate out of Bishopville. Lee County is my home county, but I cover the upper PD region and 4 other counties there. My background's in wildlife biology and natural resources. And Corey gave a really good talk, always gives a great presentation covering the high altitude view of bobwhite management. We're going to drill down a little bit in some of these early successional species and some of the native plants. And you'll notice I do focus on native. Yeah, as Corey said, I tend to want to promote the native vegetation that's out there instead of relying on some of these exotics that have been introduced, because sometimes those exotics do have problems, including bicolor there. And like Michael said, it really depends on the habitat type, the soils type, whether those plants tend to get away and spread. But there's a lot of native vegetation out there, and with the proper management you can promote that. A lot of it depends on the site history. If it's been agricultural land for hundreds of years, then there's probably not much in the seed bank that will respond to fire and disturbance. Sometimes you need to do some supplemental planting, but if you have areas nearby that are donation sites for seeds, that will work its way into some of these areas, but that's really a topic for another talk. But I want to specifically get down into the different types of habitat that bobwhite depend on, and as Corey said, it really depends on your management practices that you choose for a species. Depends on the life history of that species and what its habitat needs are at certain times of the year. I want to make sure I'm not standing in anybody's way over here. So you have to meet their biological needs throughout the year and throughout their wanderings on the home range. So the 3 really basic types of habitat that bobwhite quail require are the nesting cover, this is probably a very dense stand for this example, but it was a photo that I had, consisting of native warm season grasses. The bunch grasses that we need is where the nesting cover is going to be. Your brood rearing habitat, which still has some of those grasses interspersed, but has a lot more forb diversity, and those forbs are the flowering plants and the legumes that are going to support a lot of the insect population that those young chicks need. As Corey said, the hens, the laying hens, and the chicks after they hatch have a very high protein requirement, so they need a lot of insects. And this type of habitat with a diversity of plants in it is going to increase the insect diversity and really provide for those needs of the quail. And then the third thing is some type of cover, escape or thermal or loafing cover, and we're talking about some type of hard cover, so shrubby component or briar component. And we'll talk a little bit more specifically about each of these. So when we get to the nesting cover, as you can see, the nests are typically built in a clump of grass, and it's one of the bunch grasses. And I think I have a slide on here, if we pulled up the right presentation, that will talk about that. They typically nest in the old vegetation of last year's stalks. So it's the dead, dry material in that clump of grass that they build their nest in. The majority of those nests are within a few feet of the edge, and that edge serves as a travel lane. So as Corey was talking about some of these field borders, a lot of times the nests are going to be found within relatively close distance of some type of cover that they can move into soon after the chicks hatch and be able to move around with the protection of cover. We're talking grass clumps about 6 to 18 inches tall. Clump density, you want at least 1 per, or at a minimum 1 per 13 by 13 square, so 169 square feet minimum. That would be the sparsest that you would want it. The densest you would want it would be on about a 2 by 2 spacing, and so 1 per 4 square feet, somewhere in that range. And here's the slide that I just added, so it's not going to be in your folder. I can't stop fiddling around with my presentations until the day of, so I apologize for that. But the benefits of the bunch grasses that I keep referring to, or the native warm season grasses that you hear about a lot, are the nature of their growth form. You look at a turf grass, such as Bahia, Bermuda, some of the other turf grasses, they form a dense mat of vegetation. The bunch grasses originate from a relatively small stem or bunch of stems at the bottom of the plant, and then they spread out in an umbrella type form toward the top. And what that gives you the benefit of, as Corey referred to several times, is that bare ground between those clumps of grass that those chicks need to be able to move around in. If they're in a real dense pasture grass, those little chicks, which are about as big as my thumb, about the size of a bumblebee when they hatch out, they're going to have a hard time moving around and following mama and finding the food that they need. So that's the benefit of these native warm season grasses. And you can see some of their growth habit here, with a bunch of grass here, a bunch of grass here, a little pathway in between where the birds can move around, find the resources that they need, and yet they can duck under this cover and escape from avian predators and other predators. And I'm going to give you a quick overview, because a lot of the times when I'm working with landowners, they really don't know what a lot of these plants that they're trying to manage for look like, and what specifically are the types of plants that they want to encourage. Even some of the agents that I work with other agencies, they don't really have the training in plant identification, and so they don't know. And we're talking about maybe putting together some plant identification workshops, which, if there's a lot of interest in it, we bring one up around this area too. Get out in the woods and really identify some of these plants, as well as recognizing some invasive species that we don't want to have around. But a lot of the bunch grasses that I'm talking about fall in this bluestem group. Of course, broom sedge is a freebie. It comes into just about any field where you have some type of disturbance. It produces a light, fluffy seed, and it tends to blow in, and over a period of time, it'll colonize an area that's been disturbed. So the broom sedge is an easy one to get established. Split-beard bluestem that we're seeing a lot of the seed heads on this time of year. It has a forked seed head and a real fluffy seed on it. And then bushy bluestem, which tends to be one that grows in a little moister soils. It's got these big clumps of leaf structure at the top of the plant. Some of the other bluestems, little blue, of course, is a famous one, and we'll see some of that today, along with broom sedge. And then big bluestem, which really gets to be a tall grass. They call it turkey foot sometimes because of the inflorescence on it. But little blue is blooming right now. We'll see some of that today. It doesn't get real tall like some of the other grasses do, but it gets about like that and makes really good nesting and brood rearing cover. Switchgrass, real easy grass to get established. It's one of the ones that when you plant it, especially in the mix, you're going to see it in the first year. The blue stems, a lot of times farmers or landowners think that they've failed in their planting of these native grasses because they don't see anything in the first year. Well, just the nature of these native seeds and native plants, they don't respond like a crop of soybeans or something like that. You're not going to plant it, see a nice crop that first year. It takes them a while to get established, especially the blue stems. If you have blue stems in your mix, like the little blue stem, big blue stem, don't expect to see a real good showing of those in the first year. Second year, you're going to see them a little bit more. By the third year, they'll definitely show a presence. So don't give up on these things when you plant them. But switchgrass is one of the ones where you will see the first year. One of the things that we have found out, though, when wildlife practices were incorporated into the Farm Bill back in the 80s, there were limited numbers of seed sources available. And one of the grasses that was heavily promoted was this variety of switchgrass, Alamo switchgrass, which really came out of the Midwest and Missouri and some of those areas. It was developed by the NRCS, one of their native or their plant conservation centers. I forget what they're called. But anyway, it was a variety that was developed, and it was really developed with the sight on producing biomass for grazing. These do provide good grazing pasture in some cases. They have very deep roots, so they're very drought tolerant. The problem with it is it's very aggressive. It's really a lowland variety of switchgrass. It gets very tall. You can see this guy about to disappear, and I can easily disappear in some of the fields I've seen. It can be very aggressive, and so we don't recommend Alamo variety anymore. If you get some switchgrass, if you go to establish a switchgrass field, I would recommend staying away from the Alamo variety and asking them if they have some of the upland varieties. Bitter Panicum or bitter sea beach grass has a bluish green cast to it. It's closely related to switchgrass, but it's got a good growth form and produces seeds that become available as they drop to the ground to quail. Eastern Gamagrass, typically on a little heavier soil. You're not going to get that established well in real sandy soils, but if you have some soils that hold moisture a little more, a little heavier loam, or with some clay component into it, it's a very good grass. It starts out in a little clump, but then it spreads out into a ring, and sometimes you'll have a hollow area in the center, but it spreads out and the leaves come out and droop down, and it's a real good place for quail to be able to get under there for escape cover. It's got a very large seed on it. It breaks into segments. Maybe you've seen it before, and it's a close relative of corn, and the seeds are large enough you can actually drill it with a seed drill, similar with the settings that you would use for corn. Some other grasses, of course, three-awn grass or wiregrass really pertains to just these two species. That's real common down on the coastal plain. We do have a gap in South Carolina where switchgrass doesn't occur. We have the northern species, the stricta, in the above, say, Georgetown area and on up into North Carolina. And then south down around Charleston, the Francis Marion Forest, you start to pick up the Aristida barrickiana, which is the southern wiregrass. Indiangrasses are really good too. They don't form quite as dense of a base, but they do provide some habitat for quail. The yellow Indian grass is our state grass. It's one that a couple weeks ago when I was here for the Prescribed Fire Council meeting, we saw a lot of it out where we were doing the tour that day out on Judy Barnes Road. A ton of it was blooming at that point. And then there's a couple of other sorghastrums as well. Sorghastrum elliottii, which is the nodding Indian grass. I don't know if we'll see any of that today, either of those grasses. Purple top, I've seen a lot of that this year. Has these real loose, fairly tall panicles of seeds and flowers. It has a reddish purple color to it. They're turning brown now. I saw some of that yesterday, and we'll probably point some of that out today. Purple love grass, this is the stuff with the real big inflorescence, usually down low. And this is the one that will break off and kind of blow across the landscape. It can get up inside your pant leg and work its way up your pant leg. Plume grasses, we'll see some of those today. The giant plume grass is one that grows you'll see in ditches alongside the road. But we have some that grow on drier soils, and this one in particular, Alopecuroides, the silver plume grass, is pretty common in dry soils. Okay, let's move into brood cover. As I said, with brood cover, we're looking for a greater diversity in number of forbs. So the flowering plants and the legumes are important. The reason that this is important is because, I think Corey mentioned, the greatest mortality is in the first few weeks after the hatch. Those birds are lost. So they need that habitat, proper habitat where they can move around, find the food they need to support their energy needs, but be close to cover that they can escape from predators or hide from predators. So they need freedom of movement at ground level. So only 25 to 50% vegetative cover. The rest of it's going to be the bare ground that Corey was talking about, where they need to be able to find seeds, insects, primarily insects, and be able to move around easily. And yet they need that overhead concealment. So we need a diverse assortment of green plants within pecking height, 2 to 3 inches. That doesn't mean that you can only use plants that only grow 2 to 3 inches tall, but you have to have some of that green vegetation that reaches within that distance from the ground. We're talking about plants that are going to draw in a lot of insects, pollinators, or insects that eat the plants. And it's important that they be within 100 yards of midday loafing cover. So we need that cover nearby. This shows you some pretty good brooding habitat here with a mixture of some type of asters growing in there, black-eyed Susans or something, some clumps of grass, and a fair amount of open ground in between. And this really isn't typical what you would represent as brood rearing habitat, but I threw it in there because this was a field that had been mowed over the top of for weed suppression in an ag field. And then you could see that arrangement of these clumps of grass or these clumps of vegetation. It could be any type of vegetation, but a lot of bare ground in there for the birds to move around in. Am I blocking you guys? Can you see? And just a few pictures to show you the birds in action on this type of habitat. You see the chicks here, the hen, and the birds following around and getting up those insects, small insects, and any seeds that are available. You have that overhead cover. This little chick here is getting in some shade possibly. The thermal regulation is important throughout the brooding season. And this little guy over here, he's in some of that dense turf grass we were talking about. And he kind of looks a little forlorn and lost. He's looking around like, where's the food? But this just gives you an idea. A little bird this size trying to make its way through this and stumble around, it's using a lot of energy to move around. Just a couple more. I think Corey had this same picture there. So what are some of the plants that are going to make up some of this brood rearing habitat? Some of these broadleaf plants, the forbs and the legumes. Well, the legumes are a big part of it for several reasons that we'll talk about. The value of legumes is that they produce, for one thing, they produce a very hard and persistent seed that's very high in protein. So later on in the year, when other food resources become scarce, this seed stays around a long time. It's persistent. It doesn't break down when exposed to the elements. It can persist in the soil bank for decades and still respond to disturbance later on. So you got reseeding naturally from these. The seeds, as I said, have a very hard coat, but the birds are able to digest that coat, and there's a lot of good proteins and other nutrients in those seeds that's important. It's also a nitrogen fixer, so it can grow on poor soils. It attracts a wide diversity of insects. You see some of these plants, goat's rue and some of the other legumes, partridge pea, you'll see a lot of bumblebees, you'll see a lot of other insects associated with it. And again, some species provide good cover. This was a field border, had some native grasses in it, but where we disked a fire break along the edge of those woods, we had this flush of partridge pea that just, I don't know how long that seed had been there because we hadn't planted partridge pea there. But it came up gangbusters and persisted for a while. Of course, it's an annual, so these plants will not sprout again, but they do reseed, and then sometimes you need some soil disturbance in there to scarify that seed and get it to germinate. But again, this is a good food source. It attracts insects, and it's dense in there, but it's open on the underside, underneath. So the birds can get in there. So it provides cover, food. And this is a partridge pea. Large partridge pea on the left here, and sensitive partridge pea, the Chemicrista nictitans on the right-hand side. The large flowered partridge pea does tend to grow tall. There's a variety of it called lark It's another one of those developed varieties. We are not recommending the use of that anymore either, because it tends to, it's pretty aggressive. It grows very large, and it was used some in intermixed plantings with longleaf, and we found that it was shading out longleaf, and it promotes, was it Rhizobacter or some type of pathogen that was wiping out the longleaves. So the Alamo and the Lark, NRCS is no longer recommending using those varieties. Some of the others, the Desmodiums, the beggar lice, very important for quail, very important food source, and we have several dozen species of it that occur around here, and I can't identify but a handful of them. But of course, they produce these little things that get stuck on your pants when you come home out of the field. You just have to shave them off. But they're very prolific seed producers, and have the other benefits of legumes as well. Here's some legumes that we can talk about as potential replacements for the bicolor. Now, these don't grow as big and shrubby as bicolor. They don't have the branched form, but they are woody plants, semi-woody plants, and they produce prolific amounts of seed. Hairy Lespedeza tends to occur on drier soils in the sand hills of South Carolina and sand ridges. Roundhead Lespedeza tends to grow in a little heavier soil. And slender Lespedeza occurs throughout the range too. So these do form sporadic thickets. If you seed it, you can get a little denser stand, but it does mimic a lot of the qualities of bicolor Lespedeza without the problems of escaping and displacing other native species. The spurred butterfly pea and Atlantic pigeon wings, these are vining legumes that do produce seed, valuable for wildlife. False indigo bush, you don't see a lot of that around, but it is a prolific seed producer when it does flower. Tephrosia, goat's rue, is a really good plant. You can see all the seed pods on it, so it produces a lot of seeds. Plus it tends to grow in patches that also provide cover. It's open underneath the plant, birds can get in under there. And a couple other Tephrosias that don't really, I wouldn't consider those to be prolific seed producers, but the goat's rue really is. And you find that associated with pine woods, especially longleaf, that have been burned regularly for a long period of time. Snout bean also produces these large pods. Perennial sand bean, just a couple of other legumes. And then we get into the asters. The asters are important because they attract a lot of pollinators. Some of them do produce seed, which can be produced in considerable quantities. And once it's down on the ground, the birds can use that seed as well. But it does provide a lot of pollination benefits for a number of species. So the coreopsises, rosinweed, which can be a very tall plant, ironweed, which has bloomed recently, and now I'm seeing the seed heads around, also very attractive. And I'll go through these fairly quickly. Some more coreopsis, bone sets, the thoroughworts. These are the plants you're seeing blooming right now in a lot of the pine woodlands. You'll see this vast sea of white flowers, white flower heads out across the landscape. They're probably some type of thoroughwort, and there are a number of those out there. They're round-leaved, and there's a bunch of different species, but you're probably seeing a lot of that blooming right now. The sunflowers, a number of different sunflowers, also very attractive to insects, and therefore make those insects available to quail. The golden asters, I did see some golden aster, not Gossipina, but Mariana out on the property, and I'll try and point those out today. Grassleaf golden aster, this is the one that has the silvery hairs on the stems and leaves, and you'll see that out in the woods with the little small yellow flowers on it. It's Pityopsis, and it's very persistent. It will stick around a long time even after fire has been taken off the landscape. I see it in the yards of people in Florence, where I live south of Florence, and it persists a long time even in turf grass. So it's beneficial as well. It attracts a lot of pollinators. And then the goldenrods, which this is the time of year for goldenrods. You're seeing a lot of that blooming right now. And one aster, yeah, it is in the aster family that we don't think of, along with the other showy flowers, is ragweed. And there's tremendous benefits to quail from ragweed. The seed production, the seed is high in protein. It's a small seed, but the quail are able to eat it. But it grows in these dense thickets if the landscape is managed properly and you've had some disturbance that provides cover. So you got the seed production, attracts a lot of insects, so it's good bugging habitat, and then the seeds are available later on. A few other incidentals, smartweed, the polygonums are good seed producers for quail. Some of the nut rushes, the scalarias produce seed. Porjo, I'm sure you're all familiar with porjo, dioideas. They produce a lot of good seed production for quail, and I think it's a good deer browse as well, isn't it? And croton, it's one of the few non-native species that I included in here, but croton produces a seed that's very good for quail, heavily used by quail as well. And then we get into third type habitat, the loafing cover and winter protection, thermal cover. And these are the sites around which a covey centers its daily activities. So it's kind of the headquarters area where they would tend to gravitate towards. You may have several on the property, or several that are used by the quail. It depends on the time of the year and the range that they are roaming at that time of year. They may be as small as 100 square feet, but ideally at least 400 square feet in size, so that would be 20 by 20 feet, just to give you an idea. We want this to occupy about 5 to 25% of the covey home range. We're looking for vegetation that's anywhere from 3 feet to 6 feet tall, and still have room underneath for the birds to get into. So some species that are beneficial are the greenbrier thickets, blackberry, plum, sumac thickets are really good, or other types of woody vegetation or semi-woody vegetation that provides that dense cover. So you can see some of that interspersed in wherever this habitat photo was taken. But you have that interspersion of these grassy area and yet some heavy cover nearby the birds can escape to. So some of the species that are beneficial in serving that purpose are the sumac. Chickasaw plum is a great thicket forming plant. It will spread vegetatively and increase in size over time. Of course, these areas, if you want to preserve them, you might need to disc around them if you're going to burn. They're not typically tolerant of fire, although a lot of these drop so many of their broadleaves that don't really carry much fire that the fire will go out before it even gets underneath these plants. Even if you do run fire through and knock it back 1 year, it's going to top kill it, but it will re-sprout. So your sumacs, which in our area we have the winged sumac, Chickasaw plum, some of the other plums, eastern red cedar provides really good cover, not just for quail but for songbirds during the winter time. They eat the berries off of the tree, and it has that very thick evergreen vegetation that birds can get into and escape from inclement weather. And of course, blackberry thickets, so important, not just for quail, but for so many other species as well. The soft mass production and escape cover. Additional foods in the wintertime, some of your smaller acorn producing trees are really important. Of course, quail only have a certain size acorn that they're able to eat. So the water oak, some of the smaller acorn oaks are what we're talking about. Winged sumac, that seed is persistent through the winter time, available to a lot of the songbirds, and as it drops, it becomes available to quail on the ground. Some of the soft mast species that will persist for a while, greenbrier, does produce these berries that are an important food source. Black cherry, and there's the sweet gum that Corey's favorite plant that he's promoting for quail. Not only quail eat the seeds of sweet gum. I had a flock of crossbills come into my yard one time in Mount Pleasant and spend most of the day there. And they have the bills that are able to get into those little openings and get that seed that comes out of those gum balls. So it does have some benefits for wildlife. And then putting it all together, I mean, we're not talking about you have to have your nesting habitat over here and then your brood rearing habitat here and then your cover over here. You want to, if you manage it properly, you can have an interspersion of all that habitat in one relatively small area. So in cases where you have an agricultural field, and this is a very common condition, and then your woodlands on one side, you might want to go in there and feather the woodland trees, do a little more of a thinning out on the edge than you would in the interior, so that you promote some of that early successional habitat there. Have an established field border with some native warm season grasses and some legumes, and then it transitions into this crop field that may provide a lot of habitat for quail, some insect sources as well, depending on how it's managed. Again, you can see the broadleaves mixed in with some of the grasses. The road edges are good places for this type of habitat. This is on the PD Research and Education Center in Florence. This was an old ag field that was planted into longleaf pine. This was one of those fields I was telling you about that had been in agriculture for probably 150 years or more. And so there wasn't very much in there. In the first couple of years, we had a lot of sickle pod, Texas panicum, things like that come up that we really didn't want in there. But with continued burning and over time, each year we saw more and more native plants come in and the other things drop out without using herbicide, just using fire. So we started to see some of these thoroughworts come in that I was talking about earlier, some legumes. This was Lespedeza hirta in here. And the broom sedge, just, as I said, it's a volunteer plant. It'll come in, you don't have to plant it. But a variety of legumes and a variety of grasses. So that's a situation where you have some of this cover, and then you have brood rearing and nesting habitat in these areas. This is down near Andrews. This is Mount Pleasant Plantation, where they're doing some experimentation with a combination of grazing and along with burning. They were using burning alone, but they were finding that their forb diversity was dropping off. Your broadleaf plants were dropping off, but the grasses were getting very dense and rank in there. They could use some mechanical means of disking to knock back those grasses, but they found out that if they experimented with this grazing, following right after a fire would run through there, the next few days they would introduce cattle in there, and the cattle would focus mainly on the grasses that were coming up, and so they were reducing the density of the grasses, and they've released the whole diversity of forbs out there. It's just beautiful landscape. I was just out there last week. So that's another situation. They needed a little bit more heavy cover in there, some of that hard cover, that escape cover that we talked about. But as far as the brood rearing and nesting habitat, they have it there. And can anybody spot the quail in that picture? How about now? Look at the feathers on that, and look at that pine cone right next to it. That adaptive coloration in there. It's just pretty amazing. So that's all I've got for my presentation. I'll be glad to answer a few questions if we have time for it.